Hello and welcome to GBN Originals. This is Patrick Christie's, and today we look into a trend that's emerging amongst our younger generation, Generation Z or Z, depending on where you are. And let me tell you, what I'm about to share might just shake your faith in the future of British democracy. Yes, folks, the very bedrock of our society is being questioned by the people who are supposed to inherit it. Let's start with the numbers. A recent study conducted for Channel 4 reveals that over half of Generation Z, 52% of young people aged 13 to 27, believe that the UK would be better off as a dictatorship. Let me repeat that. More than half of our youth think Britain would be better served by an authoritarian regime. Now, this isn't just a fringe opinion, this is mainstream thinking among the younger generation. A third of these young people, 33%, believe military rule would be a good idea in the UK. Just imagine that for a moment. Tanks rolling down Whitehall, generals calling the shots instead of elected MPs. Well, it's not just shocking. I mean, it is quite chilling, actually, when you think about it. How have we reached a point where such ideas are even entertained, let alone embraced? Well, I've got a few theories, but we can talk about them later, can't we? You might be tempted to dismiss this as youthful rebellion, the kind of idealistic naivety that every generation goes through. But let me tell you, this goes far deeper than teenage angst or frustration with the status quo. Nearly half of Generation Z or Z, 47% to be exact, agree with the statement, the entire way our society is organised must be radically changed through revolution. Oh, it's not reform they're talking about, that's revolution, a complete overhaul of the system. To put this into perspective, 33% of 45 to 65-year-olds share this view. I would argue that's still quite a high number, by the way. This generational divide is as stark as it is troubling. Now, what does it say about our society? Well, nearly half of our youth believe the system that has made Britain one of the most stable and prosperous nations in history needs to be torn down. Are we witnessing the seeds of a generational conflict that could redefine our country? The study also uncovers a growing rift between young men and young women. And by the way, this is replicated in other countries as well, most notably, I believe, Japan. A divide that could have profound implications for our society. So among young men aged 13 to 27, 45% believe that we have gone so far in promoting women's equality that we are discriminating against men. A similar proportion thinks when it comes to giving women equal rights, things have gone far enough. So that is, by my calculations, an overwhelming majority that either think we've gone too far with women's rights or we've definitely gone as far as we should ever go. Now, one of the reasons for this could, of course, be what is perceived to be excessive positive discrimination, where if you see young men who can't apply for jobs and can't get certain jobs, or feel as though they are put second in job applications, singularly based around their gender, then it can breed resentment, can't it? So maybe that's what it is. So where are these young people getting their information about what's really going on? In an age where we're constantly warned about, well, fake news, you'd think that maybe our youth would be turning to the established, more reputable news sources for their information, but you would be well wrong, because according to the study, 58% of Gen Z respondents consider social media posts from friends to be trustworthy, or even more so than established journalism. And can I just say, I have deep sympathy with them for that. Let me spell that out for you. So your teenager probably trusts a TikTok video more than they trust the BBC News at 10, or maybe even a newspaper of note such as The Times. And it doesn't stop there. Among young men, 42% place their trust in influencers like Andrew Tate and Jordan Peterson over seasoned journalists, I suppose you'd call them that, who spent years out in the field honing their craft. Well, these so-called alpha males are controversial thinkers, and they are shaping the views of an entire generation. It's interesting though, isn't it? Because if people criticise them, and hey, many people do, you do have to ask, why is there a void that exists for them? Why is there a necessity, in some cases, for an Andrew Tate to fill a certain void? And whose responsibility really is that? We have a generation that is clearly disillusioned with democracy, yearning for radical change, divided along gender lines, and getting their information from online sources rather than your traditional news outlets. Well, it's not a passing phase either, though, or a generational quirk. It does seem as though this is going to carry on for a very long time. If these trends continue unchecked, though, they could potentially lead us down a path where democracy itself is at risk. As much as I believe that this country has been systematically let down by its political class for the last several decades. We've been consistently lied to, we've been misrepresented, and in that sense, democracy hasn't worked, has it? For example, people consistently, at every single opportunity, vote for radically reduced immigration. And yet what do we get? Net migration of 1 million people in 2023. Loads of people continuing to cross the channel. So I can understand completely about that. But the downside to this is if some kind of strong military dictator figure did emerge, would the youth flock to them? And that wouldn't really be the right answer, would it? But before we start wagging fingers at Generation Z, let's take a step back now, shall we? Ask ourselves, how did we get here? What's led to the youth doing this? The most educated and connected generation in history, supposedly. They've lost faith in democracy. They've embraced certain ideas that many people might regard as being quite fringe. Is it the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash? So many members of Gen Z grew up watching their parents struggle through one of the worst economic downturns in modern history. They've seen stagnant wages, rising inequality, and an uncertain job market, a far cry from the promise of prosperity that their parents enjoyed. Maybe it's the failure of democratic governments to address pressing issues, for example, like what I just said there about mass immigration. When politicians seem more interested in scoring points than solving problems, is it any wonder young people lose faith in democracy? And I do think we had a cast iron example of this that ties in exactly to what we were talking about earlier on. The case of the grooming gangs in Britain was front and centre of the news agenda for at least a couple of weeks. A systematic betrayal of mostly predominantly working class young white girls at the hands of predominantly foreign men. And then one of the things that was discussed in our parliament at that time was whether or not we should have more female football players on birthday cards. And you think, do our political class actually have their priorities straight, or are they too obsessed with things like woke DEI? There is, of course, social media, a double-edged sword, I think it can be described as. On the one hand, it connects us like never before. It's a great tool for people like me. You can get things first, you can get videos out there. There is less censorship than you will see on the legacy media. But on the other hand, it can trap us into echo chambers where more extreme views are maybe amplified, moderate voices are drowned out. Let's not forget education, or rather the lack thereof, when it comes to teaching the values of democracy and critical thinking. Are we equipping our young people with the tools they need to navigate an increasingly complex world? Or are we failing them at the most basic level? Are we filling their heads with a load of woke rubbish? Are we teaching children they might be born into the wrong body? Does that maybe lead to confusion and depression? Are we also teaching children here in Britain, well, by that I mean we are, to hate Britain's history and hate the legacy of Britain? What does that do to somebody who's growing up in this country? Does that teach them to be proud of it and to want to be an active member of it? Or does it teach them to want to tear it down, like maybe this study would suggest? But how do we address this growing crisis before it's too late? Well, it's not just about Generation Z. This is about all of us. It's our society, our values, our future, isn't it? We are at a crossroads, and what we do now will determine whether Britain remains a beacon of freedom and democracy or slides into authoritarianism. I know a lot of people will be watching this now and thinking, well, the government that we have at the moment has been quite authoritarian, hasn't it? Seemed to be locking people up and prosecuting them for social media posts, seeming to clamp down on people who criticise things like two-tier policing or the excessive cost of migrant hotels. So many of you watching this might be shouting at your television sets or your laptop screen saying we already live in an authoritarian world. I will just finish by saying this, though. I think, again, we have to wonder, why are so many young people feeling this way? Is it because when they open their eyes and they look outside, they see how much they're being taxed, they see how many broken promises our politicians are delivering, they see that every time their parents have voted, they have not received what they voted for? And does that not inevitably lead you down a path where you think things like a military dictatorship might be a better course of action? This is Patrick Christie's for GBN Originals. Please don't forget to subscribe to GB News YouTube channel for more hard-hitting analysis on issues that we think matter to you the most.